Taiwan isn't just a potential flashpoint for war. It's the most likely place where World War III could begin, and it won't be by accident. In the 21st century, this small island has become the epicenter of a dangerous power struggle between the United States and China. Both superpowers know that losing Taiwan isn't an option, but why is that? Why would they risk everything for this tiny island? To understand Taiwan's critical role in modern geopolitics, we need to unravel the mysteries of the past. Taiwan's importance isn't just about its location on the map, its roots stretch deep into a time of humiliation and conflict. How did an island with 24 million people become the battleground for superpowers? Let's step back into the 19th century for a sec, where this story truly begins. Back then, China was under the control of the Qing dynasty, but it was a time of great weakness. Starting with the First Opium War in 1839, China found itself at the mercy of Western powers and Japan. These nations, hungry for dominance, picked apart Chinese territory piece by piece, and Taiwan, then known as Formosa, was caught in the crossfire. Occupied, bullied, and divided, China's fate seemed sealed. In 1895, after yet another humiliating defeat at the hands of Japan, the Qing dynasty was forced to cede Taiwan. For the next 50 years, Taiwan would be under Japanese control. But the story didn't end there. After World War II, when Japan finally surrendered, Taiwan was handed back to China. Only this time China was embroiled in an entirely new kind of war. A civil war. The communists, led by Mao Zedong, had fought their way to victory on the mainland, but their triumph was incomplete. Their enemies, the nationalists, refused to disappear. Instead, they retreated to Taiwan, transforming the island into the Republic of China. This set the stage for one of the most complex and unresolved conflicts in modern history. But why does Taiwan still matter to Beijing? For the Chinese Communist Party, Taiwan's independence is more than just a political inconvenience. It's a reminder of the century of humiliation. It's unfinished business. The communist regime has always believed that without Taiwan, their victory in unifying China is incomplete. Yet Taiwan is more than a symbol of lost honor. Its survival as an independent entity is backed by the very Western powers that once exploited China's weakness. Beijing's obsession with reclaiming Taiwan is deeply tied to both national pride and a thirst for revenge. But the United States is not about to let that happen. Washington has its own stake in Taiwan's future, one rooted in history, honor, and the unspoken rules of global dominance. What began as reluctant involvement during the Cold War has become an unshakable commitment to defending Taiwan from Chinese control. But it wasn't always that way. In the early days, Washington didn't see East Asia as a critical battleground. Taiwan seemed insignificant, just another piece on the Cold War chessboard. At first, the United States was prepared to let Taiwan fall to the communists. After all, why risk American lives for an island thousands of miles away? Then the Korean War erupted in 1950, and everything changed. Suddenly the stakes were much higher. To stop the conflict from spreading south, the U.S. sent its 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Strait, a bold move that immediately cut off any chance of a Chinese invasion from the mainland. Taiwan had just become the front line of a much larger and far more dangerous battle for influence in Asia. From that moment on, Washington's relationship with Taipei wasn't just about alliances. It was about dominance, about making sure the U.S. held the upper hand in a region on the verge of chaos. Beijing, of course, saw this growing American presence as a direct threat, and Beijing wasn't about to back down quietly. Even as diplomatic ties were forming, the tension never truly faded. When the United States established formal relations with the People's Republic of China in January 1979 and accepted the One China policy, it seemed like a significant shift in the global landscape. But Washington wasn't letting go of Taiwan that easily. In the shadows of this diplomatic breakthrough, another move was already being made. Just 3 months later, the Taiwan Relations Act became law. America quietly ensured that it had a legal commitment to defend Taiwan's security and stability. The act wasn't just about military aid, it was about sending a signal to Beijing. Taiwan was still under the protective wing of the United States. But how would Washington play this game without sparking a full-blown war? Enter the policy of strategic ambiguity, a tactic as calculated as it is dangerous. Washington neither confirms nor denies whether it will intervene if China invades Taiwan. It's a high-stakes game of bluff, designed to keep everyone guessing. This ambiguous stance has been enough to keep the peace for decades, forcing Beijing to think twice before attempting any military takeover, but it's also kept Taiwan from declaring full independence, knowing that such a move would likely cross a red line that could push China into action. For years, this delicate balance has held, but how much longer can it last? There's more than just military strategy at play here. Ideological ties increasingly bind Taiwan to the United States, pulling them closer together in ways that go beyond geopolitics. Before the 90s, Taiwan, known as the Republic of China, was an authoritarian regime, its political system not so different from the communist government across the strait. But the winds of change swept through Taiwan, transforming it into a multi-party democracy. As the island embraced democratic values, it began to mirror the ideals of its powerful ally across the Pacific, far more than its authoritarian neighbor. And the United States wasn't just a silent observer. During the Third Taiwan Strait crisis, when Taiwan held its first presidential election, Beijing once again rattled its saber. But Washington wasn't about to let a fledgling democracy fall. It sent 2 carrier battle groups to ensure the election went ahead, without Chinese interference, forcing Beijing to retreat from the threat of force yet again. This moment cemented a deeper bond between the U.S. and Taiwan. Taiwan wasn't just a strategic ally anymore. It was a symbol of democracy's triumph over authoritarianism, and that makes abandoning Taiwan almost impossible for Washington. How could the United States, the self-proclaimed guarantor of the liberal world order, stand by and watch as an authoritarian power crushed a democratic one? The stakes are now higher than ever, not just for Taiwan, but for the credibility of the U.S. as a global leader. But across the strait, Beijing sees Taiwan in a very different light. For the Communist Party, this tiny island represents more than just a geopolitical struggle. It's a living reminder of past humiliations and a direct threat to China's current security and worldview. The stakes are now higher than ever, not just for Taiwan, but for the credibility of the U.S. as a global leader. But across the strait, Beijing sees Taiwan as far more than a political inconvenience. To the Communist Party, this island's continued defiance represents an existential threat. Taiwan's de facto independence isn't just a thorn in China's side, it challenges the very foundation of Beijing's authority and its grip on power. Taiwan's continued separation from the Communist Party's authoritarian rule sends a dangerous message to the Chinese people. Maybe they don't need to be ruled with an iron fist after all, and that idea is a direct threat to Xi Jinping's vision for China. Xi has made it his mission to support authoritarian regimes around the world, creating an alternative world order to rival the liberal democratic ideals the United States promotes. Taiwan in particular stands in stark contrast to this vision. Its cultural, ethnic, and historical ties with the mainland should make it an easy target for assimilation, but Taiwan's values and independence tell a very different story. For Xi, Taiwan's defiance is a serious problem. It's not just about geography, it's about China's pride, security, and the Communist Party's claim to legitimacy. If Taiwan can succeed as an independent democratic nation, what does that say to the people of China? What does it mean for Xi's promise of national rejuvenation and ending the century of humiliation? On the other side, the United States has its own reasons for keeping Taiwan out of China's hands. Preserving the status quo in the Taiwan Strait is crucial for America's role as the defender of a liberal world order, an order built on the sovereignty of nation-states with clear, independent borders. If Taiwan falls, that entire system could start to unravel. That's probably why, even though Taiwan might not have official borders, the United States has invested a significant amount of its national prestige in acting like they exist. A loss of the Taiwanese democracy would certainly prompt fears in the Philippines, South Korea, and Japan that they could no longer rely on the United States to defend them from an authoritarian China. Further to the south, at the end of the first island chain, Indonesia would likely find itself further aligned with China, while up to now it's attempted to hedge its bets with both sides. One could argue that notions of prestige and saving face don't amount to much in a potential conflict with a nuclear-armed power. After all, the United States made similarly vague references to committing to the defense of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine in exchange for its returning its post-Soviet nuclear stockpile to Russia in the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. 20 years later, Ukraine found itself partitioned. 28 years later, it faced a full-scale invasion. The United States did not make any military moves to stop either of these things from happening, largely out of fear of coming to blows with a nuclear-armed Russia. However, unlike Ukraine, other interests are involved that make Taiwan of much greater importance to America's 21st century foreign policy. When relations between Washington and Beijing were normalized, China was still a military and economic backwater. America's primary focus was on deterring Soviet aggression in Europe. That situation has completely changed. In the following half-century, China emerged as the world's second-largest economy and had embarked on an unprecedented military buildup, which significantly shifted the balance of power in a region that increasingly found itself at the heart of the global economy. Because of this new geopolitical reality, Taiwan's location makes it difficult for Washington to ignore. The island is a mere 112 miles across the strait from mainland China, and sits at the center of vital global trade routes. Half of the world's fleet of container ships pass through this small area too. Whoever controls the straits controls this. There are two other important maritime crossroads nearby. Just to the north of Taiwan, there is the Miyako Strait, which runs through a gap between Japan's southernmost islands. To the south lies the Luzon Strait and one of its main channels, the Bashi Channel. These are also important trade routes and act as choke points from which the United States and its allies can exercise leverage over Chinese commerce and military expansion into the wider Pacific Ocean. These points of leverage are only part of a long-standing national security strategy in the United States called the Island Chain Strategy. This strategy was the brainchild of John Foster Dulles in 1951 and came as a means of containing the expansion of communism in the Pacific Ocean. Because of its geography, Taiwan sits at the center of the first and most important of these island chains. This string of islands lies close to mainland China and comprises close American allies, ranging from Japan and South Korea to the Philippines. This status quo means that the United States and its partners can exercise hard power leverage over China, while China cannot easily return the favor and threaten American assets outside the region. The United States has continued to strengthen its position in the first island chain by increasing military cooperation with Japan and the Philippines. Japan hosts more American troops than any other country, with about 55,000 total. Recently, the United States has been basing some of its premier military equipment in its Japanese bases, including an increased presence of F-22 Raptors. Japan itself is in the midst of a rearmament period not seen since World War II. Meanwhile, the United States has expanded its footprint in the Philippines, including with new bases in the north of the country that can easily intervene in a dispute over Taiwan. China has traditionally been a land power. It's focused its military resources on protecting its borders from the many enemies it had to the north, south, and west. The place it could be safe from invasion, that situation has now turned on its head. Because of its position in the global trading network and the regional political alignment against it, China has invested heavily in a naval buildup, hoping to break its containment within the first island chain. However, when it began to do this, China was still a long way from being able to directly challenge the U.S. Navy, so it adopted an anti-access area denial, a 2AD strategy to take advantage of its geographical closeness to the contested theater and America's distance from it. Most notably, China built thousands of ballistic and cruise missiles that pose a severe threat to American ships and bases in the region. The closer you get to the Chinese mainland, the bigger the threat is, and Taiwan sits in the most dangerous zone of China's missile umbrella. To project power further away, China went on an unprecedented shipbuilding spree. It now has the world's largest navy by sheer number of fleet units. Most notably, China has built 3 aircraft carriers, the third of them, the Fujian, named after the province directly across the strait from Taiwan, is only the second in the world to feature an electromagnetic catapult. China has a 4th aircraft carrier on the way too, which will be the first such Chinese vessel to be nuclear-powered. The nuclear power system will not only keep it at sea for longer, but will also permit it to operate high-energy weapons. China does not intend to stop at 4 aircraft carriers either. It plans to have 5 or 6 in operation by the 2030s. And unlike the United States, it can concentrate all of them in the region with the protection of its A2AD network. But even with the geopolitical considerations, would China actually try to use these new weapons to take Taiwan by force? After all, Vladimir Putin thought that his level of force was so overwhelmingly superior to Ukraine that he will be able to subdue it within days with nothing more than a strong protest and sanctions by an overawed West. That didn't turn out as he'd hoped. Would Beijing want to risk similar sanctions and even larger losses in an operation against Taiwan? Would the potential payoff be worth the risk? Taiwan is not only the center of the first island chain, it's also the center of one of the most important industries in the global economy. This island is the key manufacturer of semiconductors. 90% of the world's most advanced computer chips come from this one place. And that output is because of one company, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC. These chips are vital components not only in your laptop or cell phone, but also in your car, refrigerator, microwave, washing and drying machines, television, and almost any piece of technology in your life that you can think of. These chips are also vital components in the push to transition the world's energy supply. Going carbon-free and mitigating the effects of human-induced climate change is a major policy priority for the world's most advanced economies. However, the technology needed to make carbon-free energy, such as solar panels and wind turbines, to say nothing of the computers needed to operate nuclear reactors, also depends on the chips coming from TSMC. Naturally, Taiwan's semiconductors are important components in modern militaries too. They needed to power fighter jets, precision missiles, navigational and communications equipment, fire control systems, and even the kitchen appliances that prepare food for some troops. More recently, the United States and China have become competitors in a race to develop artificial intelligence. Both parties depend on TSMC's chips for that too. Any disruption to the semiconductor supply chain would have a devastating impact on the global economy. It would also leave the U.S. military short of the equipment it depends on. Washington naturally fears that a Chinese takeover of Taiwan would be disastrous for the U.S. economy and American national security. An invasion of Taiwan would physically damage the semiconductor industry, and likely lead to a wave of affluent refugees that would include many TSMC personnel. However, with so much chip infrastructure already on the island, Washington fears that a takeover by the mainland would leave Beijing decisively ahead in the tech race. China became the center of the world's manufacturing in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Now, Beijing plans to become the world's leading technology manufacturer. As part of this plan, it intends to reduce the United States' role in the global economy to being a producer of raw goods. The raw goods will be shipped to China for manufacturing and refinement. From there, China will export these finished goods to the rest of the world, including back to the United States. A Chinese takeover of the semiconductor industry in Taiwan would give it a major boost in that plan, while also giving it the geopolitical position necessary to exclude the United States from much of the commerce in the Indo-Pacific region, which accounts for 60% of the world's GDP and 60% of global maritime trade. There is a preview. China has become the decisive leader in the world's electric car industry. It was a strategic policy Beijing began in the early 2000s when it realized it would never overtake American, European, and Japanese automakers in traditional gas-powered vehicles because they had established themselves for a century. So China made moves to become the center of the emerging battery-powered vehicle market, with Beijing giving out tax breaks and subsidies to domestic companies. The policy worked, and China is now in position to get the most benefits from the rapidly growing electric car market. But those vehicles still require TSMC's chips. If China were to gain control of them, it would be in a much better position to dominate other technologies and exclude the United States and its allies. In his confirmation hearings while being considered for the job of United States Secretary of Defense, former Marine Corps General James Mattis said that nations tend to go to war for three reasons: fear, honor, and interest. For the United States and China, all three are concentrated in Taiwan. Mattis was an influential figure in shifting the Pentagon's national security strategy away from the counterinsurgency operations in the War on Terror and toward competition with peer or near-peer competitors like China and Russia. And his successors in America's national security circles have become concerned over a potential invasion of Taiwan as early as 2027. Other experts believe that the danger is most acute in the next 10 years. With China's slowing economy and aging population, it'll be less well-positioned to make a move on Taiwan in the middle of the century than it would be in the near future. Additionally, China's potential adversaries in the region that also have an interest in Taiwan, like Japan and the Philippines, will be better armed than they are now. Taiwan itself is building a more capable missile force, including investing in projectiles with the range to hit important places on the Chinese mainland. Examples include the 600-kilometer swing Feng the Sekiri, which can strike the bases across the strait that China would need to use for an invasion, and the 1,200 to 2,000-kilometer Yunfeng, which can strike Beijing, Shanghai, and other important places deep into the Chinese interior. Many policymakers in Washington fear that these additional pressures will incentivize an invasion sooner rather than later, especially in the absence of a strong deterrent from the United States. But what do you think? Will Taiwan become the center of a military confrontation in the near future because of all these competing interests? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.